Today, we come together to remember and celebrate the life of Dag Hammarskjöld. His death lies 6 decades in the past, but his legacy lives on to this day. It lives on the power of his example, as a reference for compassionate, courageous leadership, as a benchmark for integrity and idealism, and as a standard for selfless service. Dag Hammarskjöld understood that the United Nations, like our world, is not perfect, but he knew it is indispensable. As we look ahead to the new session of the General Assembly, that has built on his extraordinary legacy to address the challenges and seize the opportunities before us, and together build a more peaceful and just world.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If you're joining us for the first time, I'll say do yourself a favor and go back to the first episode, because joining right from this point, you'll have missed out on so many things that we've already uncovered. I'm glad to say that we still have Professor Henning Melber with us. We bolted all the doors, all the windows, and we're not letting him go until we milk as much history as as we can from him. So, Professor, thank you so much for being patient with us. Yeah,
it's
good.
a pleasure.
We are talking about Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN Secretary General. And in the first episode, we talked about his life, his upbringing, his amazing career in the civil service, all the way to being made the second UN Secretary General. And towards the end of the episode, we were talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, this newly independent state that literally days into independence was starting to unravel. We're talking about the Katanga secession, the involvement of Union Minier. And so if you can do yourself a favor, go to the first episode and listen to the info that will be very important as we take off from here. So, Professor, we were at a place where Katanga had seceded. The Belgians and all these other countries have sent their mercenaries into Congo. Moise Tshombe is being emboldened, and Congo is in crisis. Lumumba is trying to stabilize the nation. And in the midst of all these things, there is a UN body and a UN Secretary General who's very... And I know there were several African countries that were getting independence at that particular time, but Dag Hammarskjöld was very concerned about Congo.
That's true.
Yeah.
But it was actually the ousted Patrice Lumumba who appealed to the United Nations seeking intervention. And sadly so, it was based on a misunderstanding, because Patrice Lumumba thought that the UN, if they follow his appeal, would intervene in the Congo to bring him back into office. And the misunderstanding was based on the willingness of Dag Hammarskjöld as Secretary General to look into the necessity for further conflict prevention, or at least reducing the conflict, to obtain a mandate for the Congo, but following the principles of the United Nations Charter and his mandate that the United Nations are not supposed to undue intervene in domestic affairs of a country. So there were two things happening. Dag Hammarskjöld asked his legal advisors in the Secretariat to look into the ousting of Patrice Lumumba, and if this, based on the existing laws in the Congo, was a violation, a breach of constitution or other laws. And at the same time, he was seeking the Security Council's approval for a mandate in the Congo.
Professor, you've talked about, someone who may be listening to us is wondering, the ousting of Lumumba. So ousting by who? Probably you can just paint the picture of this ousting of Lumumba. Yeah.
I would have come to that now, because that was part of the legal conclusions.
Okay. Yes.
So, the legal advisors, when examining the case, said that the preliminary constitution of the Congo allows the president of the country to dismiss the prime minister if there is at least one minister in cabinet who supports that. And this was the case. So the legal advice the Secretary General got was this cannot be in a convincing way be categorized as a coup, as an unlawful ousting of office, which in the perception of the majority of Congolese and maybe even ministers in the cabinet was seen as unlawful, but bound by the interpretation and the principle not to intervene in domestic affairs as long as they were not in violation of the existing law and order, in as much as law and order existed in the Congo in that transitional period, which was another complicating factor. Hammarskjöld understood the mandate not to reinstall Patrice Lumumba. And he got the mandate only by exerting some pressure on the Security Council, by saying, if the Security Council is not willing to give me the power for seeking a conflict resolution in the Congo, I will have to go through the General Assembly of the United Nations. Very unusual, for the first time that a Secretary General came up with that. At the end of the day, he got a very vague mandate by the Security Council, which from day one created an unsolvable problem for the execution of the mandate. Because it was so unspecific that it basically allowed Hammarskjöld on the one hand to do whatever he thought is the right thing to do, and on the other hand allowed members of the Security Council to intervene and criticize and correct whatever he does. A total catch-22, which Dag Hammarskjöld first welcomed, because it gave him the maneuvering space which he thought allows him to find solutions, meaning to bring back Katanga into the territory of the Congo, find a solution in the conflict between Lumumba and the other faction, which notably included Mobutu, who became then the president of the country he renamed into Zaire. He was the head of the army and he was very influential. But he basically ran into the wall on every side. Lumumba couldn't accept that the United Nations intervened without reinstalling him as prime minister. The Belgians were not willing to let Katanga as a secessionist province go back and be integrated in the Congo in a constellation where they were afraid that they and other Western powers would lose the direct access, the exclusive direct access to the natural resources they were in control of. So Katanga was a playing field for hundreds of mercenaries. They were basically the military force of Katanga, of all Western secret services. They were all there. They were all there to protect their interests through a kind of secessionist independent Katanga province under the leadership of Moise Tshombe. And meanwhile, in the Congolese territory, Patrice Lumumba was, and that was the perspective of the UN, protected by blue helmets while he was kept under house arrest. And the view of the UN was, at best, they can protect him for being assassinated to make sure that he stays in the place where he is, as long as there is no lasting solution to the conflict. Patrice Lumumba decided to leave the protected shelter, which he perceived as arrest, and trying to mobilize for ousting the then government in the Congo to be replaced, the head of state. And within weeks, he was captured by the Katangese and the allies of the Katanga province, plus direct involvement of the US American Secret Service.
Yeah.
And he was brought to Katanga together with his closest friends and allies, tortured, and finally executed.
That's what part I've never understood, because Katanga was simply it was a rich province, but it was a province down south. When they captured Lumumba, it would have made sense probably to take him to the capital. So clearly there was a plan to eliminate him from the start.
Absolutely. It was a planned assassination, and it could be carried through because of the complicated conflict situation in the Congo. Because the next question is, how did they manage to bring him to the Katanga province?
Yeah.
The UN presence was not strong enough to keep sufficient control over movements, over what is going on, what is happening, to effectively intervene. And there was most likely a certain reluctance to show more force on the ground because of this fear that it would be considered as an undue interference into domestic affairs. This complicated, complex situation was fertile ground for very different opposing interpretations. So until the very day, you have quite strong criticism of the role of the UN and in particular of Dag Hammarskjöld, with some people accusing Hammarskjöld to bear the main responsibility for the assassination of Patrice Lumumba as basically in support of the Western interests in the Congo. And you have the other side, and I confess to be part of that, which is obvious in any way during our conversation.
Yes.
Dag Hammarskjöld, well, maybe had too much of a naive belief that UN member states remain loyal to the principles of the United Nations Charter, but also a firm belief and conviction that he is navigating in the only possible way between a rock and a hard place. That Lumumba was captured and brought to Katanga was only reported with delay to New York. And for quite some time, Dag Hammarskjöld did not even know that Lumumba was assassinated, executed under horrible conditions. What we know is that he was in shock about the news, that among others, he was on record saying that this is the worst case scenario because without Patrice Lumumba, there is no condition to create a peaceful solution to the situation in the Congo. And this was not fabricated. The evidence is convincing enough by witnesses where you could say, well, this was not a quickly constructed exit option to get him out of prison, so to say, out of prison in the sense of being blamed, being partially responsible for this nightmare.
Yeah.
There were letters, there were statements, they all basically give evidence to that. And those critical of Hammarskjöld always accused him of being just a convenient servant and ally to the Western powers. But if you look at his role in the 2 years he was involved in the Congo conflict, he on numerous occasions, in rather blunt ways, accused the Western powers of violating the UN Charter and setting their own agenda instead of being in true support of finding a solution for the Congo. At the same time, the Soviet Union blamed Hammarskjöld for selling out the Congo to the West.
Yeah.
And they asked for his resignation as Secretary General.
Is this that?
What was-
Because I've seen a video of Khrushchev banging the table at the UN secretary, the UN. Oh yes.
That was the General Assembly
Yes.
where he also demanded that Hammarskjöld
Yeah.
resigns.
Yeah.
There is another very revealing, several minutes long film on YouTube accessible, where Hammarskjöld responded to this demand the next day. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, it's not verbatim, but he said in substance, it's very easy to resign when the big powers ask one to do. It's more difficult not to resign as long as you are willing to give voice to those who do not have the influence in the United Nations they ought to have. And he said, as long as they are not asking me to resign, I will stay in the office. And at that moment, he was interrupted by a standing ovation by the leaders of the most influential countries from the global South, by Nasser, by Sekou Touré, by Kwame Nkrumah, by Nehru from India. They stood up and applauded him. You can see that in the video clip.
Yeah.
And until the very day, I'm getting emotional when recalling that moment.
By resigning, I would therefore, at the present difficult and dangerous juncture, throw the organization to the winds. I have no right to do so, because I have a responsibility to all those states members for which the organization is of decisive importance, a responsibility which overrides all other considerations. It is not the Soviet Union, or indeed any other big powers, who need the United Nations for their protection. It is all the others. In this sense, the organization is first of all their organization. And I deeply believe in the wisdom with which they will be able to use it and guide it. I shall remain in my post during the term of office as a servant of the organization in the interest shall remain in my post during the term of office as a servant of the organization in the interest of all those other nations as long as they wish me to do so. In this context, the representative of the Soviet Union spoke of courage. It is very easy to resign. It is not so easy to stay on. It is very easy to bow to the wish of a big power. It is another matter to resist. As is well known to all members of this assembly, I have done so before on many occasions and in many directions. If it is the wish of those nations who see in the organization their best protection in the present world, I shall do so again.
Because it underlines something which can be accepted. He was the Secretary General of those who were not provided the adequate voice at the table of the powerful. And they documented that with that standing ovation.
Yeah.
So he basically stayed in office knowing that those countries who were the closest allies of Patrice Lumumba, who were in support of true sovereignty, were backing him in his way of trying to find solutions. It eroded a little bit in the months to follow. It would be not honest if I would maintain that impression. He was facing so many problems in negotiating that the limits of his office became very obvious in the months to follow, which then also made some of those leaders more reluctant to give him the confidence and trust and faith which they had at that very moment when he stood up and rejected the demand by the Soviet Union to resign. And that is one of the sad tragedies Dag Hammarskjöld experienced, which ever since then every other subsequent Secretary General until the very day experienced the limits to the office. You are the most important international civil servant, but your service, even when with the best of intentions, is limited by those big powers who follow their own interests, which are not in compliance with the fundamental principles of the United Nations. And it has not become more obvious than during the last 2 to 3 years. Dag Hammarskjöld was the first one who experienced it the tough way.
Mhm.
And it ultimately motivated him even to be willing to sacrifice his life in the effort to find a peaceful solution to the conflict in the Congo.
That brings me now to my next question, because on this burning this desire to find a solution in the Congo, he decides to fly there himself in September 1961. And what was the intent of the mission when he was going down to the Congo in 1961 in September?
It was obvious for the dynamics unfolding in 1961 that there won't be a solution to the conflict as long as Katanga remains a secessionist separate entity controlled by Belgium and other Western countries and mercenaries from Western countries. With the presence of the CIA, of MI6, you name it, they were all there.
Yeah.
Belgian and French security mercenaries. So Dag Hammarskjöld, who also, as we know, following the records, got some very ill advice from a group close to him in his secretariat, which was dubbed the Congo Club, decided ahead of the new General Assembly annual meeting in September to fly to the Congo to find out what could be done. And he basically decided on the ground to seek a meeting with Moise Tshombe, as far as we can reconstruct, with the idea to offer Moise Tshombe a high-ranking position in the government of the Congo if he was willing to give up the secession of Katanga. Now, the meeting itself, which he proposed to Moise Tshombe, was actually, strictly speaking, in violation of the mandate, because he was willing to directly negotiate with someone responsible to a large extent for the conflict, as a Congolese participant in the conflict, who was not a partner to negotiations. And when it became known in the West that Hammarskjöld plans to meet Moise Tshombe, and Moise Tshombe, delighted about this recognition, immediately agreed to meet on, well, neutral grounds which were not neutral, namely Ndola, in the northern region of northern Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe. Zambia, sorry. Today's Zambia, as the mining town in the border area to the Congo. They got very, very worried. And in the archive are accessible now messages of diplomats on the ground who reported back with concern that there seems to be an arrangement of a forthcoming meeting of Hammarskjöld with Moise Tshombe in Ndola.
So this is sorry, go on. Sorry. Okay. So this is a decision he made on the ground. When he left in New York, this was not part of the plan.
It was not on the cards when he left New York.
Okay. Yeah.
It came up as a spontaneous decision on the ground within hours after arrival to say there can only be one desperate effort to get out of this situation, to negotiate with Tshombe directly what might be a possible solution, where Tshombe is willing, against the interests of the Western countries backing him, to give up Katanga, return it as an integral part to the Congo, and in reward, so to say, become one of the highest political office bearers in the government of the Congo.
Okay. Yeah.
And the Western countries were alarmed. They said, what is going on? What is he doing? We had no idea about that. And I misspoke by saying Ndola in northern Rhodesia, the former northern Rhodesia, the current Zimbabwe. It was Zambia.
Zambia, yes.
The whole federation of which northern Rhodesia was part of
Yes.
was clearly under the control of Rhodesia.
Yeah. Oh.
Which then turned into Zimbabwe. So
yes.
northern Rhodesia was not influenced by those who took over independence in the Republic of Zambia. It was basically a Rhodesian empire. And to that extent, it was anything but neutral. It was a settler colonial occupied territory being firmly under control of a Western ally, the Rhodesian regime. So the mere fact that there were these strong concerns were a contributing factor to later questions to what extent existed there an interest to prevent that this meeting could take place. And Hammarskjöld himself was aware that this is a very risky mission. One of his closest associates was the Swedish official on the ground, Sture Linné, who at that time just had become a father. And Sture Linné was supposed to join Hammarskjöld on the flight to Ndola. And he embarked the plane, and Dag Hammarskjöld told him to leave the plane and stay behind because he just has become a father.
Oh, so this was in Leopoldsville.
It's almost as if he had a vision that this is something he might not survive. And in markings, the posthumously found and published notebook, he had entered a poem weeks before his death, which seemed to anticipate that his life will soon come to an end. So it's really something that makes you wonder about coincidences. To what extent did he willingly embark on a mission which then cost his life?
So he gets on the Albertina, the plane, and flies to Ndola. So what we know, what we've been told, is it was at night as they were approaching the Ndola airport. There was a pilot error and he crashed. So I think he went around the airport, and then as he was coming to land, he went into the trees, and that's how the plane crashed. That's what we've been told. Of course, there are other theories, but from where you sit, what really happened? Or what do you believe happened? This whole journey from...
Pilot error was promoted rather successfully, but luckily not by all, by the, in total, 2 commissions of inquiry by Rhodesia, and it was supported by a Swedish commission of inquiry after it initially listed pilot error only as one of 4 possible causes for the plane crash. And they were later then changing that in the official report to pilot error as the most likely, most probable cause of the crash. Which, by the way, has motivated a new initiative called the Brunegard Group, after the member of parliament in the Swedish Riksdag, Gudrun Brunegard. Just now they submitted a report, this group, where they say there were so many inconsistencies in the changes of the findings of the report that they are now demanding from the Swedish government to establish an independent commission of inquiry to explain why Sweden, while initially having doubts about the pilot error, followed the Rhodesian and the British explanations that this was the most probable cause of the plane crash. And one of the reasons of that report motivating this commission is to say, through that report, you stigmatized the families of the pilots, the Swedish pilots, their partners, their relatives, their children since then. And when this report was presented only a few weeks ago in the Swedish parliament in an event, there were 3 sons of the then Swedish pilots, all very old in the meantime, in attendance, who deeply emotionally shaken supported the demand that it should be clarified why the blame was shifted to the pilots. I mention that because there is also a human dimension to findings of such reports of investigations. Now, what nurtured serious concerns were several reasons. First of all, in Ndola were Western diplomats waiting for the plane to arrive. Moise Tshombe was already there and waiting somewhere else. There were all the Western security agencies present.
Yes.
There were present several planes of the US Army who were able to record already the contact between the Albertina when approaching and the Ndola airport. Now, Albertina informed the tower that they are approaching for landing. Then they made a turn and approached again, and they disappeared. The plane disappeared. What is the usual response to a plane disappearing?
You
Start looking for the plane. What happened?
Yes.
Well, not in Ndola. The tower decided to switch off the lights on the airstrip,
What?
saying most likely the plane decided on latest, shortest notice to fly to another place. They left the tower and said, we will find out where the plane has landed instead.
What? My goodness.
Only the next morning, a search began. And what would be the most usual location where you start a search? Maybe where the latest messages from the plane were received. Well, the search started at different directions. The wreckage of the plane was officially discovered only in the early afternoon of the next day.
So that's on the 12th. Prof.
On the 18th.
On the
The
18th, yes.
death-
18th, yes.
The afternoon of the 18th. The time of death of Hammarskjöld and the others is soon after midnight on the 18th of September. Only in the early afternoon of the 18th of September, the wreckage was officially discovered. But there are credible testimonies of eyewitnesses who saw that the wreckage was already cordoned off in the morning of the 18th. They were passing the road and saw that there was cordoned off a plane wreckage. There was evidence by Africans in the vicinity in the forest, charcoal burners, who, when interviewed, said they saw a plane and they saw lights of what they perceived as a second plane nearby the plane. They saw an outburst of fire before the plane crashed. Those eyewitnesses were dismissed as unreliable, as natives who wanted to say bad things about the government in northern Rhodesia, meaning the Rhodesian settler minority authorities. They were dismissed. Interesting enough, and luckily so, there was a UN Commission of Inquiry. And this Commission of Inquiry concluded that there were 3 or 4 possible explanations for the plane crash without ranking them in any order.
Okay.
This included a pilot's error. This included sabotage at the plane. This included an attack in the air, and it included, I don't remember the fourth one, but it left open what was the cause of the plane crash.
Mhm.
And when adopted in 1962 by the General Assembly of the United Nations, the resolution significantly so said, in the case that any new convincing evidence comes up, investigations can, upon decision of the General Assembly, be resumed again. And that was the window of opportunity which was created to reopen investigations more than 50 years later. Maybe I should add to some of that evidence that was brought up through the decisive pioneering work of Susan Williams, who published 50 years after the death of Hammarskjöld and all the 15 others on board of the plane, a book, Who Killed Hammarskjöld? She did not give an answer, but she raised so many questions based on inconsistencies and facts which verified the findings that there was sufficient reason of doubt that this was an accident caused by human error or anything else. These included a pointer that the US, which recorded the conversation between the plane approaching and the tower in Ndola, refused access to any transcripts. That presumably there are records in the UK, in South Africa, and definitely in the USA, which offer more information on the circumstances that led to the crash of the plane. In the absence of making these available, you ask yourself, of course, why is that so? Do they know things they want not to be known? Because imagine for a moment if it would become an established fact that the Secretary General of the United Nations was killed in an attempt of assassination, and the fact would have been known, even if maybe not executed by the West, but by mercenaries of Katanga, what it would mean, even when disclosed today. So all these inconsistencies added up to the book published by Susan Williams, which motivated a handful of people to institutionalize an enabling group, as they called themselves, saying something must happen based on what is presented in this book. And they asked a group of 4 distinguished international legal experts and judges to look into the evidence presented by Susan Williams to see if this justifies an initiative in the United Nations with reference to the resolution adopted in 1962 to reactivate a new investigation in the causes of the crash of the plane. And after 1 year of pro bono work, these 4 international renowned legal experts submitted a report which concluded that there is sufficient probative value, that's the standard jargon, to merit renewed investigations in the case. This report was handed over to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who then gave it to a group of appointed legal experts to investigate if this is sufficiently convincing. And the conclusion was, yes, it is. There is sufficient probative value which merits further efforts to investigate what the cause of the plane crash has been. But in that situation, while this was the official finding in the office of the Secretary General, you would still need a UN member state to submit a proposal to the General Assembly to adopt such a resolution. And this was at a time when there was a conservative government in Sweden which felt there was no interest in bringing the matter again to the fore. And by a funny coincidence, national parliamentary elections in Sweden in September of the year voted into power again a government by the Swedish Social Democrats, who then within a week decided we are willing to submit a draft resolution. This draft resolution was then adopted by the General Assembly in December of the year, meaning that the United Nations, through the Secretary General, are tasked to establish a new commission of inquiry looking into the details now known to find out what happened in that fatal night of the 17th to the 18th of September 1961, causing the death of Dag Hammarskjöld and 15 others. Now, let me add, it sounds to me like a fairy tale. If you would have told me 15 years ago that the book of a scholar and a group of a handful individuals plus 4 renowned jurists, legal practitioners, would be able to convince the United Nations to decide on new investigations into the plane crash, I would most likely have said in a flippant way, and the Pope is a black Muslim woman. What I mean is, it would have never ever led to new investigations, which now go on for more than 10 years with 3 times extension, if there wouldn't have been such a private initiative, which in itself is actually a worthwhile case study how civil society and scholarship is able at times, depending on the constellation, to create a new situation which no one would basically have taken a bet on.
That is a lot to digest. Wow. Because I can imagine, I'm trying to think of another assassination, but anyway, that one also has an issue. 1963 over 62, 63, KFK. Guys were swinging into action immediately. It's strange how, to me, it even seems amazing that it seems like no one cares. It's like maybe the powers that be don't care. It breaks my heart. Breaks my heart that all this thing went this way. So up to now, we are still waiting for the report from that commission.
Well, we have received 3 reports so far.
Okay.
What happened as a result was that the General Assembly followed a proposal by the Secretary General after another round, which it takes too much time to go into details, to appoint a retired Tanzanian Chief Justice Othman as eminent person asked to investigate the causes of the plane crash. And Judge Othman has since then presented several reports with more and more evidence added that suggests that this was definitely not a pilot error, but forced by external damage caused. And several of the most notable insights established was that initially the argument was it would have not been possible that there was a second plane in the air.
Yeah, I saw that.
Because there was no plane around which could have been used. There were no pilots around which could have been used. There were no airports in the vicinity which would have provided the logistics that this could have happened at all. All 3 of that have in the meantime been dismissed by factual evidence. There was a number of pilots, mercenary pilots based in Katanga, who were able to use such a plane. And there were airports in the vicinity which could be used.
For takeoff,
so that in itself fell apart. The eyewitness testimonies of the more than 10 Africans in the forest, independent of each other, could be verified as credible. The eyewitness reports I already referred to, that the wreckage of the plane was discovered already in the early morning of the 18th of September and not as proclaimed in the early afternoon of 18th September. was a fact.
Mhm.
Notably also, there was one member on board of the plane who initially survived the
Yes.
crash.
Mm.
And he was only officially discovered in the afternoon after spending hours and hours wounded in the sun. He was brought to a nearby hospital. When interviewed, he was talking about an explosion. He was talking about another object in the air. It was dismissed as the fantasies of someone who was out of his mind. He died in the hospital, and as far as could be reconstructed, he could have been saved if he would have received the necessary available medical treatment. Now, all of that given in itself, if you look at each of that as a piece of puzzle, you could say it's not enough. But if you put the pieces of the puzzle all together with some of the very important missing pieces of the puzzle, namely a transcription of the communication, of the air traffic communication between Albertina, the plane, and the tower in Ndola, which, by the way, has not on record the communication, despite the fact that at the time it could have been recorded. If you would add what is missing, where the suspicion is that it exists but is not released, it nurtures more and more the assumption that this was not an accident. There is the argument it might have been an effort to redirect the plane and prevent it from landing in Ndola without the intention to make it crash. So that the accident was basically that this external effort to redirect the plane resulted in the crash. But the end result is the same. It was external influence that made the plane crash, either intentionally or unintentionally. And that is the most important conclusion at the moment. And number of people are realistic enough to assume there will never be a fully conclusive finding of investigations, simply because too much will remain in the dark because it's prevented to see the light of the day. But thanks to the resolutions of the General Assembly and thanks to the continued work of Judge Ottman, we can say there is sufficient evidence which gives credibility to the assumption that this was not a pilot error.
Now, in terms of the country, in terms of Sweden, from have they ever healed from this? Because I think it's one of the biggest tragedies they've ever faced. Has the country ever healed from this, or is it something that up to today is in everyone's mouth or in the conversations?
Unfortunately, it is not. Dag Hammarskjöld is a widely recognized and celebrated Swedish personality. In the latest issued banknote, 1,000 Swedish krona, it has his face on the note. Here in Uppsala, the longest road is the Dag Hammarskjöld Avenue. You have Dag Hammarskjöld busts in different places in Swedish cities. In Jönköping, his place of birth, in Uppsala. So you have the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. So there are quite a number of symbolic recognitions of Dag Hammarskjöld. But his memory is fading. I usually, once in a while, pass the family grave of the Hammarskjöld family. And much to my comfort, I see that once in a while there are fresh flowers put down at the plaque remembering Dag Hammarskjöld. So there are still people who continue to cultivate his memory and pay respect. But it's not necessarily any longer an integral part of Swedish public knowledge and commemoration. That's where the Brunegard group I referred to comes into the picture, which against all odds, now 65 years later, comes to the fore and says the Swedish government has a responsibility to address the issue why the Swedish Commission of Inquiry followed, influenced by the British and the Rhodesians, the findings that a pilot's error was the most probable cause of the crash. And it's actually rather unlikely that this demand is met, which in itself indicates that there is a certain reluctance and say, why take the skeletons out of the closet?
Yeah.
Let them there.
Let them lie.
Which is rather general Swedish way of handling. They have never properly investigated the disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg in Prague during World War II. Or Budapest, not Prague. They have never really properly investigated the assassination of Volker Bernadotte in Israel by right-wing Jewish settlers. Let them sleep. The investigations of the assassination of Olof Palme
Yes.
were dragging on with in a way of handling it where you're asking yourself, where is actually the serious determination to bring to the light what really happened? So Dag Hammarskjöld is one of several examples to say this seems to be a Swedish way of handling matters, which is not the way it would be handled in other countries, who would most likely be more keen to find out what really happened, if not even obsessed to say we need to find out. And Swedish civil society has not really been much occupied with demands that there should be done more to investigate what really happened.
So, Prof, we've almost at the end of this conversation, and I just have two questions for you. Number one, this is more hypothetical, and I know for a researcher and a historian, probably you don't want to hypothesize, but do you think if he lived, if he made it to Ndola and met Tshombe, or probably even because Tshombe was still controlled by, Minia and all these other guys, if he lived on until the end of his tenure, do you think the Congo would have been different from what we see today?
I'm confident enough that this would have happened.
Wow.
The mere fact that Moise Tshombe was so flattered, he immediately was willing to meet Dag Hammarskjöld in Ndola, is an indication that he could have been talked into a solution where he would give up the secession of Katanga in return for being rewarded with one of the highest ranking political offices in the government of the Congo. I'm convinced, because also given the concerns of the Western powers that this meeting took place, is for me an indication that they were afraid that this very unusual and unconventional way of seeking a solution could have been successful.
Oh, okay.
Or put it differently, if everyone would have said, let them meet, nothing will happen.
The same
It
way.
would have not prevented, most likely, the plane Albertina of a safe landing.
Yeah. The fact that he was able to bring his charm and was able to get the Chinese leaders to move, probably the same charm would have worked, quote unquote, for Congo. Yes, and I tend to agree with you. I agree with you. One last question. After years of studying this subject and just studying his life, what is the one single most important lesson you hope African leaders can take away, or Africans in general like us, can take away from the life of Dag Hammarskjöld?
His values and his principles. For him, it was decency and integrity which motivated and impregnated his whole life. You're speaking truth to power. You're not compromising on fundamental values and principles, and you never ever pursue an agenda for own privileges and benefits. The reward is a totally immaterial one, that you are recognized as an advocate of human rights and decency and a proper way of life in the service of people and values.
Wow. Professor, And on that note is where we close this episode. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your insights, and the new knowledge that you've given us. I normally call Right Place, Right Time this history class that we never had. And I believe today, me and everyone who's watching is richer and better because of what you've shared with us. Thank you so much. And may the legacy and the soul of Dag Hammarskjöld continue to rest in eternal peace.
I would like to thank you, Steve, for providing me the opportunity for this conversation to bring to a wider audience the values of Dag Hammarskjöld, which deserve to live on.
Indeed. Thank you so much.